my soul starts to linger. It's home, I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me along to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam.
Before the 1700s, that was a tract of wilderness known only to the native people. Well, then came the fur traders. They brought the European economy. And then began a whole series of events that changed the course of history. Set against a backdrop of Riding Mountain here in the south, Duck Mountains over to the northwest, and off in an easterly direction, Lake Dauphin, was the area known simply as the Valley, or Dauphin country. With that view, and contemplating that history, it's a little like sitting in an amphitheater watching a three-act play unfold on the stage below. So, come join me in this theater. I'll tell you about some characters who fulfilled missions and ambitions and hopes to make a home here in what is now known as the Parkland region of Manitoba. Low, yet it swells to the heaven's blue dome. Child lips have called the wild meadowland home. Emily Mamanis. The Keystone Province of the West, Manitoba, a name suggested by Louis Riel, meaning in Ojibwe, the Straits of the Spirit. It was the La Vérendrye brothers from Trois-Rivières, Quebec, who in 1739 christened the nearby lake after the Dauphin of France. Based at an outpost at the junction of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers, today the city of Winnipeg, they built a series of trading depots in the interior. The one nearby was called Fort Dauphin. The surrounding lands encompass what is called a black soil zone, recognized for its stable agricultural economy. Still much a pioneer region of the prairies, numerous smaller half-section farms in the parklands produce wheat, canola, flax, and barley. With a population base close to 9,000, the community is a prosperous supply, distribution, and transportation center, serving a region stretching from the Saskatchewan border, east to Lakes Manitoba and Winnipeg, and north to Swan River. It is also a government administration center. But the town of Dauphin is very much down home. It's not difficult for a newcomer to town to find a spot where one can quickly be brought up to date with the crops, the weather, who's who, or simply whatever. Folks from here will tell you that if there is one sound synonymous with the place, it is the call of the mile-long freight as it works its way across the valley. More than anything, it is the distant voice of the white man's settling of the wild meadowland. The fur trade, and ultimately the railway with its influx of people, would see the bison herds vanish. Guiding the traders along the water highways which threaded the prairie landscape were the Cree, Ojibwe, and Assiniboine. Controlled by the Hudson Bay Company, little was known of Rupert's Land. In 1857, 2 expeditions were assigned a survey. Captain John Palliser headed a British group, while the moving spirit of the Canadians was this man, Henry Ewell Hind. A professor of chemistry and geology at Trinity College in present-day Toronto, Hind left Fort Garry, eventually making his way to Lake Dauphin. Leaving instructions for 3 of his men to cure all of the fish they could take because there was a possibility of the lake freezing, at sunrise on the morning of the 9th of October, he set out for the ascent of Riding Mountain. Along the base, they followed a well-worn path described by his Métis guide as a pitching tract, a communication road used by natives for generations. For the first mile and a half, the country is quite level and dry, the soil excellent, and hay abundant. We now followed a moose path until we arrived at a high conical hill, which promised a fine view of the surrounding country. At a distance, this magnificent range appears to be clothed with forest, and to rise from a level plain to the height of about 800 feet above the level of Dauphin Lake. The timber on the hill consists of aspen with a few small oak. The soil on the plateau is of excellent quality, and the underbrush very luxuriant. Hind's report made its first appearance in the parliamentary papers of 1857. His optimistic notes outweighed the less enthusiastic findings of Palliser and ultimately influenced the imperial government to refuse the renewal of the Hudson Bay Company charter 2 years later. The door to the west was now opened. Hind's narrative is a documentary of extraordinary vision and foresight. At 8 p.m., the sky was quite free from clouds. A comet shone with brilliant luster. A flashing aurora gradually spread over the northern sky. The stars glistened like diamonds in the south, and the whole heavens assumed that aspect of silent beauty which renders night in the wilderness so impressive and sublime.
Well, about 20 years after Hind had finished his job, a young man, actually he was just a kid at 18, found his way to Winnipeg. He was born and raised in what is now the nation's capital. It was called Bytown then. And he came from what we like to call old family. His mother was a Sparks. His father was a Burroughs. Anyway, this young adventurer articled in law, and then by sheer chance found himself in this neck of the woods with a survey crew in 1875. And what he saw here was a gold mine in land and timber right out there, ready for the taking. Well, young Theodore Burroughs, or T.A., as he came to be known, sure didn't waste any time. And for the next half a century, he was at the center of every major event that took place in this valley.
Burroughs soon turned law into industry, and within a few years his operations blanketed western Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Among others, he would build mills at Swan River, Grandview, and Dauphin, eventually controlling a total of 30 lumber yards, stocked with the material to shelter new arrivals. Stuart McLean.
The first settler to arrive in the Dauphin area came in 1882. They came basically along the ridges which had been shores of the old Lake Agassiz. And from that time forward, particularly from 1883 until 1889, was the largest influx of early settlers.
Public Works tendered for the construction of a road over the Riding Mountain in that year, further encouraging the flow of people. The beginnings of urban growth began to spring out of the endless horizon.
In the beginning, in the Dauphin area, there were two communities. One was a post called Gartmore, a mile south of the present town of Dauphin. The other was called Lake Dauphin, although it wasn't on the lake, but it was a mile north of the present town of Dauphin.
This is rapidly becoming one of the best and surest mixed farming districts in Western Canada, wrote J.B. Terrell at the time. This kind of optimism, coupled to the opening of the immigration route from the south, created endless expectations.
T.A. would become the superintendent, overseeing the building of the road that for years was known as the Burroughs Road. And by this time, he was well connected with the right people, enough so that he was involved in a furious round of wheeling and dealing that decided the future of the two villages.
Before long, he was land commissioner and enticed two businessmen to look to the Dauphin country. Donald Mann was a contractor on the Transcontinental Railway, while William Mackenzie was part owner of the Toronto Street Railway. The two would set out to compete with the CPR for colonist transport and grain shipping, laying a new line north. Speculation abounded. Where would the steel rail land? Helen Marsh.
I would imagine you describe it as equivalent to some of the political hassles of today. You know, two tug-of-war teams, because each one thought they were going to get the railway, and each settlement seemed to have a fair number of buildings and people that had come in because their services were needed, and to be getting the railway, I would fight for it too.
Jobs, economic stability, permanence. What was to be called the Canadian Northern Railway could mean boom or bust. By October, the deal was done. The right-of-way would run across land that separated the villages. Cheers rang out on December 23, 1896, as W.A. Walker, engineer, and Dad Ristine, conductor, ushered in the first train. Dauphin had come into being as the newest village in Manitoba. Overnight, 70 buildings had been moved to center around the rail. The Dauphin Press described the mood on its front page. The plain, unvarnished tale of progress made in converting a level stubble field into a town with several blocks of buildings closely built would rival the Arabian Nights and would hardly be more credible to a stranger. The railway, which became the center of gravity for Dauphin nearly 100 years ago, still affects day-to-day life. By coincidence, the first leg only went a short distance beyond, to the town of Grandview, at the foot of Duck Mountains, where Burroughs controlled the largest lumber mill in Manitoba. He went on to become lieutenant governor of the province, Mackenzie and Mann to knighthood. Today, the town reflects the mixed urban farming population. The street layout diverges from the established north-south surrounding grid and is pivoted to accommodate the rail corridor at its center. The Canadian Northern, through numerous amalgamations, became a transcontinental system by 1915. In the end, financial difficulties led to nationalization, and ultimately it became a component of the CNR. Of the vestiges of the early community, one institution remains an important part of the town's social life. Once the local hangout for end-of-shift railway workers or passengers killing time, Veals is much unchanged since the days of the spittoon. Here, the beginning of the steel rail is still a part of everyday conversation.
What a party that must have been. Burroughs, Mackenzie, Mann, sitting proud aboard that first train. And they knew this was just the beginning. As for the town, well, it was now on the right track. It wasn't long after that that the Laurier government's scheme to settle the Great West began to pay off. At least it did for the government. The next passenger cars to pull in carried the first of a proud people journeying to a new land.
Likened to a modern-day Moses, the man who led a mass exodus of Slavic people from Eastern Europe to the plains of Western Canada is today remembered. Dr. Stella Hanyuk is a professor of Ukrainian studies.
Dr. Joseph Oleski was one of the unsung heroes of the immigration story. He was a professor of agronomy in Lviv, in the capital of Galicia. It was on his own initiative, as a kind of philanthropic move, that he studied Canada.
Oleski knew the hardships experienced by the farmers in the eastern part of the then powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire. The subdividing of farms made it nearly impossible to support growing families. Debt and high taxes left little future, especially in Bukovina and Galicia, provinces in the western Ukraine that were hardest hit.
The landlords had the monopoly on the forests. So to get forest, or to get anything that a forest could bring, they had to either pay for it in cash, and they were cash poor, or they had to work for it. So they wanted land, and more of it, and they came to settle on land.
Dauphin country resembled their homeland and nurtured the roots of settlement. 1 year after the railway arrived, Father Nestor Dmitri dedicated a Cross of Liberty and sang the first Ukrainian Mass in Manitoba, a tribute to a new but tough beginning.
They took the long train ride across the country. Many despaired of ever seeing civilization. They came from a place that had villages every 2 kilometers, and going across northern Ontario was a horrifying experience for some of them. So when they saw the lights of Winnipeg, they were thrilled that there were people in this country. The first year was the toughest. People found that they didn't live in a village, for example. They despaired often that they would never have communities again like they'd come from. They first had to build shelter. If you can imagine, in May, building something for a family of 5 or 6 to spend the night, they had to get logs, put up lean-tos, or dig a hole. A variety of methods were used to just cover them for the first while. Once they had a viable shelter, if they'd come in the spring, the men would usually help to get the yard or the farmstead established, and leave the women and children for the rest of the summer and go and find work. Their culture was misunderstood. Their needs weren't always understood. They banded together, they turned inward to some extent. There was discrimination, there was misunderstanding, misrepresentation, of course. But by about 5 years, we know that in most of these settlement nuclei, there were schools operating, there were churches, there were community halls, and there were feast days and weddings and baptisms and celebrations like there had been back home. And again, there were misunderstandings of those. They liked to have a good time when they had a christening or a wedding. Sometimes they were seen as drunken and boisterous and loud, and they sang a lot and they danced long into the night, but that was part of their culture. The Ukrainians left in this territory a legacy of good, sound farming. They left lands that were cleared, farmed well, successfully. They emptied places that nobody would have touched before. And they stayed longer than perhaps others would have. They gave us the idea of perseverance and hard work and determination to succeed. I think they also left the legacy of their culture. They've given this to Canada. They have no desire, no great desire to look back. It's all for us who will live to see it, and their children and grandchildren. The landscape, the buildings, the churches, these are what they've left.
And so it sings, this harvest song, through years, the bridge of time. A mix of peoples like you and I, glory days along the rail line. And yet, to stop and look at the lives of men, strength of women, their stories, plentiful and proud, of history that is theirs alone. Words carried on the prairie winds from the child lips that have called the wild meadowland home.
Whenever I go, wherever I to that place I know, it'll always be